Okay, well, welcome everyone. It is such an incredible honor and privilege to be invited to host and share this wonderful conversation on also my mentor, as well as the speakers, Thomas Berry. And the focus of today's forum will be the spiritual and ecological vision of his life and work, which is hard to compress into only an hour and a half, but I'm sure the speakers will do an amazing job. So let me introduce them without further ado. We have with us Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, who are both well known for their involvement with the founding of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I've known them for years because of our mutual association with Tom and Brian Swim. I would highly recommend that you join the forum and follow them. They put out incredible newsletters and links to incredible programs. I'm just waiting to retire myself out of my professional life so I can deeply embed myself in your programs and to find the time. They're also the author of a biography of Tom Berry and collaborated with Sam, who's also a speaker, on Journey of the Universe with Brian Swim, as inspired by the new story, Thomas Berry's new story. And just one other thing that I didn't know, John, and very impressed that you have served as the president of the American Teilhard Association and Mary Evelyn as vice president for over 3 decades. Talk about following in the footsteps of Tom. That's just, that's what a legacy. So Sam is an environmental educator, writer and activist, and the next generation beyond ours to embrace Tom Berry's teachings. He serves as a lead mentor for the Yale Coursera online courses that I mentioned in Religions and Ecology, which he helped develop with Mary Evelyn and John. He's also project manager for the Emmy award-winning Journey of the Universe film and multimedia project, hosting the Journey of the Universe, 10 years later podcast, and editing the monthly newsletter. Sister Kathleen Noon Dagnan is a member of the Congregation of Notre Dame and Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at Iona University in New Rochelle, New York, where she taught from 1980 to 2021, and now serves as founding director of the Dagnan Institute for Earth and Spirit, a multifaceted project in support of the cultivation of global citizens for the emergence of a global ecological civilization. There's much more to say about all these speakers, but you will find a detailed description in the information sent about this webinar. So I encourage you to look at it in great detail and follow up with some of their affiliations. So if I may, there are 4 presentations, as you know. Mary Evelyn is going to speak on Thomas Berry's life, wisdom, and compassion, followed by John, who's going to speak on cosmology and ecology, shaping the Earth community, followed by Sam, who's going to do, his topic is the new story in Journey of the Universe, and finally, Sister Kathleen's going to speak on the poetics of the Ecozoic, which is very exciting. So may I invite Mary Evelyn to start presenting? Each speaker will have 15 minutes. We will then have a minute of silence between speakers, just so that gives a chance to reflect and absorb their wonderful words of wisdom. And then at the end, we will have about a 10-minute panel discussion between the speakers, and then open it up to questions from the audience. Okay, and hopefully we'll wrap up well within before the full 2-hour slot given to us. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roberto, and for your work as an architect and the beautiful church that you were so involved in Toronto. And we want to bring Steve Dunn into the conversation because he was a great passionist friend of Thomas Berry and one of your teachers. So I chose the words wisdom and compassion to speak about Thomas's life, because these are the great terms in Buddhism that we're looking towards both insight and compassion for the world, how we ground ourselves and how we have outreach to the needs of the world. And this was Thomas in so many ways. Everyone could sense his wisdom and also his outreach, his presence to people, his sensibility, even though he was part of a monastic order. So think about that. The evolution of this extraordinary figure in wisdom and compassion. And lest I forget to mention, he was an author. One of his very first books was on Buddhism, 1967, and so on. And these are some of the things he taught us at Fordham, the religions of Asia in particular. But let me start with his early life in Greensboro. As you know, he's from a large Catholic family, 13 children, and they would go to Sunday masses, and then they'd have these very large gatherings of friends in the after mass, big breakfasts and so on, because you didn't eat in those days before mass. But it was a very convivial family overall, and I think he benefited from the spirit of the family and very close to his parents. His father ran a coal delivery business, and he was very good to those in need, African Americans and so on. And he always imprinted that in the children. So this family, Catholic family in the South, where Catholics were in a very strong minority, they were quite unusual, in fact, was important in Thomas's life because he realized what it was to embrace a spiritual path at an early age, despite not having others embracing that path in the community. Now, he went away at a very early age, at 14, to St. Mary's High School up in Maryland. And it's where his brothers had also gone away to school. And if you think about it, he was away, even though he came home in the summers, he was away from 14 to 80, really. And yet he kept close to his family. He'd go down there every summer in August, drive all the way down, spend most of the month there, and so on. But in high school, which frankly he didn't find too challenging, let's say, but he did probe, examine his own vocation, his future, and so on. And it was there that he decided he would like to enter a religious order. It was either, as you know, the monastery or prison, he used to say jokingly. And he decided the Passionists because he heard a preacher in Greensboro that he was enamored of. And this order, being a monastic order, he knew he'd have time to think. They did retreats as well, but it wasn't a teaching order, which had a big influence in his life because he had to fight to teach later on at Seton Hall and so on. But he did his theological studies up in Dunkirk along Lake Erie, and also back in Springfield in Massachusetts. And then he returned to Dunkirk to teach in the novitiate there. And he was a radical guy. He was teaching Marxism and European history and things that weren't exactly in the curriculum. And for a variety of reasons, both his desire and I think maybe the order's desire to get him away from the novices, he went off to Catholic University for his graduate studies, his PhD. And that really opened up a much more intellectual environment than he had had up to that time. He was able to begin some of his studies even in Asian traditions and even in Native American traditions. It's quite amazing. And he wrote his dissertation on Vico, one of the great philosophers of history. John will mention that. And after Catholic University, he went almost immediately, within a few months, off to China. And this was the great, I would say, watershed of his early life, because it changed everything. Just as I went off to Japan at age 23, and it changed my life. And this is one of the things that so attracted me to him, because he, to this day, I would say, of all the many people I've studied with in Asian studies, he had the most profound insights into these traditions. And he was driven, as was I, to go beyond the West, to find the wisdom, the cultural heritage of these great civilizations, especially China. And he went off on the boat from San Francisco. There on the wharf was a young lady waving to her husband, who was standing next to Thomas, and that was Fanny de Barry. And next to Thomas was Ted de Barry. And by the coincidences of the universe opening up pathways, these became lifelong friends and huge supporters for Thomas before he was known, before he had found his way, etc. Now, Ted and Thomas spent quite some time, and this was 1948, and they spent about 6-7 months in Beijing studying language, beginning to study these great traditions, especially Confucianism. But Mao was on the border of Beijing, and they had to leave. And so they were evacuated, and travel in these days was pretty intense. So the boats took days and days, weeks and weeks. But this friendship was so significant. And I come back to this theme of wisdom and compassion that Ted de Barry also moved forward in. They both lived what they were studying in terms of these traditions, and especially Confucianism, because they saw it as something that was a life way, a spiritual way, but also something that affected education, society, politics, views of nature and the cosmos itself. It's the most comprehensive, I would say, cosmological tradition, along with, of course, indigenous traditions, which preceded it by thousands of years. But together, when they returned to New York in later years, they founded, Ted and Thomas, the Oriental Thought and Religion Seminar at Columbia. But even before that, Thomas had another abroad experience, and that was in Germany as an army chaplain. And from that time, he developed many friends. It was quite amazing. And also seeped himself into European culture and history, which was his base. He's a cultural historian, like my grandfather, Carlton Hayes at Columbia. And they knew each other, who they were. They were trying to bring history out of a political and military mindset into how culture mattered. So being in Europe was very important. He met Christopher Dawson, one of the great historians in the UK at that time. And from returning from Germany, he wasn't in an order that would send him to a university. So he went to Queens, to Jamaica, where they had a monastery, and became a doorman and helped many people who came there with their problems, especially women who were dealing with their personal problems. So he used to joke and say, well, Confucius was a doorman too. Now this monastery has now been transformed to Thomas Berry Place, and we hope that the programs there will reflect the legacy of Thomas, and Kathleen and Kevin and others are working in that direction, which we're delighted about. But he was asked to teach at Seton Hall over in New Jersey, and it was quite a commute. And the Passionists didn't want him to do it. And so there's this struggle. And he said, I'm going to leave if you don't let me teach over there. He went, taught a very small class, but it was a launching of his teaching career. He then was asked to teach at St. John's University, right there in Queens. And they had, and both schools, Seton Hall and St. John's, had an Asian studies program, which was very unusual in those days. There was a huge faculty upheaval about pay and rights of faculty and so on. This was a diocesan university. And he was asked to resign, and along with other faculty, a huge struggle, which a lot of people don't know too much about, but it wasn't an easy period for him. But fortunately, Christopher Mooney up at Fordham, who was a great Teilhardian scholar, reached out when he heard what was happening at St. John's and said, Thomas, will you come here to Fordham to teach? And he did. and he moved to Riverdale. And again, that was another huge watershed for him. Going to China was, but coming to Fordham, things came together, even though it was an enormous amount of work. He helped build up the only history of religion program in any Catholic university in the country. I think probably almost to this day. And it was unique. People came there from Columbia and Yale. They turned down offers to come and study there. It was electrifying. I came back from Japan very disoriented, trying to find my way. And the minute I met Thomas, I knew this is my teacher. And of course, I was very lucky to meet John as well, which was very exciting and wonderful. And he married us 45 years ago. So we worked closely with him, certainly at Fordham and after Fordham. But I would just want to highlight just maybe two more things to make this condensed. The Riverdale Center that he established there, and that we worked there very, very closely. And Kathleen and Kevin, many other people came as well, because he was head of the Teilhard Association, as Roberto said. And we had these Teilhard talks each month on themes that were of interest to Thomas, which extended Teilhard's ideas to the present and to the environmental crises. They were wonderful talks with potluck dinners afterwards. And we were trying to create a community around Thomas that would support this extraordinarily unique genius, mind, and vision. Because it's not easy, as we know, for someone of that intelligence, perception, long vision, to have the space and support to develop their ideas. And each summer he would give a conference on some of his ideas, New York City, economics, etc. So those were very special years, more than 20 years. We eventually took that library apart, which was a huge dismemberment. But each stage of his life, it was this unique combination of wisdom, the distance, the insight, and compassion. He knew this had to go, this had to change. And from that time, and by the way, his leadership of the Teilhard Association and the meetings we had for years and years at Union Seminary, and I see Judy Emery and again, other friends from the Teilhard Association, we were a great community because he was such an inspiration for all of us in the Teilhard Association. So finally, he moves from Riverdale back to North Carolina, and the last 14 years of his life. So the first 14 years of his life was there, the last 14 years. We would visit him often to edit his books, go over every sentence, because he kept saying, I don't want to be improved. He didn't want too much editing. But it was a joy to work with him, think through these ideas, and I still read these books with every sentence is luminous, truly. And it's why we're thrilled that Brian Brown's reflections on, illuminations of the great work that Kathleen and Kevin made the space for in their Thomas Berry dialogues at Iona, that will be published by Orbis this year, because it's the 25th anniversary of the great work. There'll be a French edition of the great work, and there is a Chinese version that just came out. So this work is ongoing. Many people are involved in it, the Sisters of Earth and others. I'd love to name more, Sister Gail up at the monastery in Vermont. But I'll end with wisdom and compassion embodied in Thomas, interwoven over a lifetime of more than 80 years. And we are so grateful to be in that lineage, all of us, of this wisdom keeper. So thank you so much for being here today and celebrating Thomas.
Thank you, Mary Evelyn. I invite you now to just take a minute of silence to kind of absorb Mary Evelyn's talk, and then we'll come back to John. Okay, John, may I invite you now to share your presentation?
Thank you so much, Roberto, for moderating, and Sam and Kathleen, it's really wonderful to join you. And thanks, Neil, for the invitation to get together like this. And Mary Evelyn, let me stitch a bit on the warp and woof that you've given us in terms of Thomas's life and thought. My title, Cosmology and Ecology, Shaping the Earth Community, I thought I would take each term and explore it a bit in terms of Thomas's life, to raise some ideas then and situate them in Thomas's life. With regard to cosmology then, cosmology, I think, is most clearly understood in Tom's larger thought work as story. When he uses the phrase new story in the essay and then introduces his reader to an encounter with the evolution of the universe, this is certainly cosmology, and he sees it as story. We can use terms like worldview or Weltschmerz, the Weltanschauung in the German, very old academic term, the sense of worldview, of understanding story in a conceptual mode. I think Tom was inclined to the conceptual, but also very open to what Kathleen is going to explore with this, the poetic. So let's have that, if it's a tension, let's call it a creative tension in Tom's life that's ongoing. How old is this story? He reflects later in life about the meadow across the creek. I think many of us know that story, but just quickly, as a youth, the family has moved in Greensboro. He's ridden out on his bike, or he's at home and is ridden out, and he sees a meadow across the creek, and lilies are blooming in the meadow. And this image stays with him for his life, and he will return to it later in life as a seminal moment, an iconic moment, if you will, in the Greek Orthodox tradition, and unfolding and entering into. And what did he enter into? What? Cosmology, story. I think there's much to be said there, but there's lilies in a field that are speaking to him. And the field as a whole then is speaking to him, cosmology as a whole. So very early on, I think Tom has this sense of expanding his vision. In his graduate studies, he would encounter a term that we often use, the English Renaissance human or Renaissance man, to describe someone who moves very adeptly and skillfully in different disciplines. But I think one of the original Italian terms for this concept, uomo universale, Thomas would use that in his teaching occasionally. The sense of a universal human, a Renaissance ideal of expanding one's understanding. So I want to resonate back to the meadow across the creek and see how Thomas was driven by something in his genetic makeup, if I could go to that. As a Christian and raised in the Catholic tradition, all of us are aware of the cosmological dimensions in the Lord's Prayer, for instance. Our Father who art in heaven. It immediately opens up the cosmological in our prayer life. We may not always think of it in these conceptual terms, but I believe it's implanted in all of us who come out of religious training. Certainly Thomas then, he has in his Catholic background this very early cosmological piety, cosmological prayer life. If cosmology is story, if it also grows out of our experiences, it has the capacity to shape our view of the world. And like a story, it moves over a period of time. So time is a dimension to Tom's cosmology. We will see this take a very clear shape in his thinking when he will draw the sharp distinction between, say, earlier modes of human cosmology that we're largely space-oriented, and that the time orientation of evolutionary time is a radical transformation. So time in Thomas's cosmological thinking is really a central point. And if time enters into his thinking in his graduate studies, then he would link this very clearly, or come to it in a different understanding, as history. And that would be his career choice then, cultural historian, as Mary Evelyn has said. What does that mean, a cultural historian? I think this is something that we can talk about in the questions, and I'll also further my remarks about that. But cosmology then as story. Ecology as a term, we can very clearly link with Ernst Haeckel in the 1860s, and Tom was aware of this. And he was aware of ecology late in his career as something that became part of his shaping influence. So I would not say ecology was working as a conceptual shaper in Thomas's early life or early graduate studies, but not until the 1970s. But just to reflect for a moment, ecology, when it emerged in the 1860s, had a very strong holistic dynamic as an academic discipline, and it gradually did grow as an academic discipline. In fact, ecologists would see the larger ecosystems, that term emerges in that field, and the larger interactions of biodiversity. Ecology would see it largely as a whole. And they struggled then to find their voice in the scientific community, because the scientists would push back with the question, what is your metric? We do not see the whole that you are speaking of, obviously, so what's your metric? Ecology became, I would say, obsessed, if not fixated, on finding a metric, and gradually food pyramids, energy flows, all of these would become ways of finding a metric so that ecology could have a scientific place. But that early holism has continued in ecology, and there's several significant thinkers who have maintained this. And so ecology came to Tom having this subtext of holism and an overt attention to the metrics of how a biosystem, how do you measure this flow of energy in a biosystem? Shaping, or just another word about ecology. I think Tom also, in his cultural studies, came to see interdependence in the Buddhist tradition. He came to see the relationships of heaven, earth, and human in the East Asian, especially Confucian traditions, as early and cultural expressions of ecological wisdom. So again, Tom is working on a number of levels with this term ecology. Shaping, just a brief term, obviously cosmology, ecology, and the points I've raised are shaping Tom, and Tom is also beginning to shape these fields. It's interesting to think then of culture, a cultural history. Certainly, Mary Evelyn made the point, and I think it's worth revisiting, that history had strong militarism and also the great man influence in history. But by Tom's graduate studies, cultural history was beginning to pay attention to art, to the larger context. And so the modes of the humanities are also entering into cultural history. These are shaping Tom in his understanding of interdependence, of the sense of the body of Christ in the Christian term, as Paul lays it out. All of these proto-ecological understandings in the religions of the world. Certainly, Tom's encounter with the sociology of knowledge, the sense that our cultural or social context shapes our understanding of the world. I think Tom was very much given to those kinds of ideas, but we all know how he expanded, homo universale. He expands his idea of sociality into biodiversity, into the natural world, ecosystems. So shaping is a very interesting dynamic. And lastly, I would say words and language. Tom became acutely aware of the kinds of terms that are used to transmit ideas. And Tom played in that arena extensively, coming up himself with neologisms and following the lead then of Teilhard de Chardin and some of these concepts. With regard to Earth community, then, this is a concept and a term, a phrase that Tom himself developed to talk about biodiversity and the shaping of biodiversity in this cosmological development, in its ecological interdependence, and the sense of the shaping of the Earth community of humans, and how humans are now so intrusively shaping the Earth community itself. From Tom's graduate studies to 1970, I would say that the cosmological dynamics were primary in his thinking. And so the cosmological stories of the world's religions, that was the arena in which his thinking was taking shape. But a subterranean river running through that was the sense of the interrelationships of these traditions and the context in which they were working. And by 1970, Tom made this very clear shift with cosmology bridging to ecology. So this became a central focus in his work, and a key personality in this regard is Teilhard de Chardin. And so with Teilhard's thought, Tom resituated the human in the mainstream of evolution. And in that sense, he moved from the redemptive emphasis as he saw it in the Christian religious tradition to recover the creation, the sense of cosmology as the nature of reality. So his religious name, Thomas, from Thomas of Aquinas, gave to Thomas Berry the capacity to find his voice, his Christian voice especially, from the medieval cosmological emphases found in Thomas of Aquinas, in which the whole of creation, there is nothing better in creation than the whole of creation for expressing the divine. These powerful influences from Thomas of Aquinas blossomed now into his understanding of the cosmology ecology bridging. So it's after 1970 then, meeting Brian Swim, finding a scientist who is really musical to his thinking, writing with him Universe Story, bringing this bridging of cosmology and ecology forward in ways that all of us are aware. His capacity to move beyond the sad, bad news that began to make itself so clear to him, the sense of the pressures that the human was putting on the Earth community, and to move through the cosmology, ecology understandings into this larger understanding of the Earth community speaking to us. And finally, then to Earth jurisprudence from the 1990s to his death in 2009. His capacity to articulate a radical new turn in his thinking, where the sense of the Earth community, as he understood it, as having subjectivity, namely a voice. The universe is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects, cosmology, ecology, and the Earth community having voice, and we need to recover the rights of the Earth community. So Tom, I would say, as an integrative thinker, from his early encounter with Uomo Universale, moved towards a bridging of domains that put him in touch with universe evolution, and brought him to an understanding that that universe evolution was apparent to us in the Earth community. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Very beautifully said. We'll take another minute, and then I'll invite Sam to provide his presentation. Thank you, everyone. Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Roberto, for moderating our discussion today, and to Neil for the generous invitation. It's a gift to be with you all here today from other sides of the pond and from different parts of our blue-green planet. Always a gift to gather in this circle of many mentors I see on this screen. Mary Evelyn and John, who I've been blessed to study with for over 4 or 5 years now, and Sister Kathleen Dagnan, who's become a real mentor and champion of our shared work at Iona. Lisa Shebley as well, who's a friend and mentor of mine from my years of teaching in the Connecticut Berkshires. And I thought I would start with that idea of story and of ancestry in how I entered this conversation, because I was taking up my first teaching post, teaching philosophy and religion at an independent school in the Connecticut Berkshires when I first came across Journey of the Universe. And I remember driving through the Berkshire Mountains of Connecticut to this retreat center, a place called Wisdom House, for a program on Journey of the Universe. And it was at that time where I first watched this Emmy Award-winning film that was co-created by Mary Evelyn and John, along with Brian Swim, telling this epic story of cosmic evolution. And at that point in my life, I felt these stars begin to align in my own night sky. For a long time, I had wrestled to integrate my spiritual sensibilities and relationship to a larger reality with my commitment to ecology and my deep concern about the nature of our Earth's systems and our climate changed reality. And so this film brought together these different parts of my being, the spiritual and the ecological, through the lens of story. And so about a year later, I followed Mary Evelyn and John to Yale Divinity School, where I enrolled in this interdisciplinary program in religion and ecology. And it was at that point where I first read Thomas Berry's essay, The New Story, written in 1978. And when I first came into contact with this great figure, and many of you can probably recall those kairos moments of your life where you read something or you come across a person or an ancestor who is opening some kind of door, a door that you have been searching for a long time. And it was one of those experiences. And the New Story essay provided a context behind Journey of the Universe that I had found so enthralling. And in that essay in 1978, which John referred to in Thomas's increasing concern with cosmology and with the great sense of upheaval humans were wreaking on our planet at that point in 1978, with the onset of the Industrial Revolution and the technological age we were stepping into. Thomas saw this sense in which we were in between stories, and that we orient our lives around stories, whether it's the gospel narratives or the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Vedic tradition, the Jataka tales of the Buddha. Stories are what give us our overarching sense of values and orientation in life. And in that essay, Thomas writes about how we're living in between stories, and in particular, the classical biblical stories that had oriented Western civilization for much of the last few millennia were not functioning in their proper context. And he cites that with regard to the Black Death of the 14th century, where in about 20 years, 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population was killed by this devastating disease. And in that time, Thomas writes that the natural world became associated with a place of great threat and destruction, and that humans were looking to a ethereal plane or heavenly realm of deliverance from a world of suffering. And Thomas writes, from at that point, the Christian tradition in particular became more focused on a redemption orientation over the creation orientation that had informed other pre-modern thinkers, such as Thomas Aquinas, as John was just describing. At the same time, in that essay, Thomas writes about the advent of modern science through the writings of Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton, and the attention to a larger evolutionary reality, this sense of emergence from simpler forms to increased complexity through the evolutionary process. Something that Teilhard de Chardin, as a paleontologist, really illuminated in the early 20th century, this sense of living in a time developmental universe. And yet Thomas writes that despite all the accomplishments of modern science in the last 400 or so years, there has been a distorted attention to the physical or external dimensions of physical reality, and a disregard for the psychic or the creative principles undergirding the natural world. And so Thomas in this essay is seeking an integration of that personal creative principle he derives from our inherited religious traditions and the emergent scientific story of cosmic evolution that has been illuminated to us as a revelation, as Teilhard de Chardin would say, through the discoveries of astronomy, of physics, of chemistry, of biology. And Thomas writes in that essay that we need a new story that is grounded in a larger story of the universe, a story in which hydrogen gas, in the words of the Journey of the Universe film, transformed itself over 13.8 billion years into butterflies and the music of Bach and you and me. And Thomas writes that the human is that being in whom the universe becomes conscious of themselves, and that this is a profound spiritual reality that we live into, and that we need to presence our values and our worldviews to this sense in which we dwell in a sacred universe, or what Teilhard de Chardin calls a divine milieu. And so that concern for orienting us toward a new story becomes Thomas Berry's project in this essay, a story that moves beyond even an American context, even a Christian context, and toward a context of an earth community, that perhaps for the first time we have a comprehensive functional cosmology of shared cosmic origins to which we can dwell and belong. And Thomas in that essay writes that the universe process is guided by three principles. First, the principle of differentiation, that the unitive moment of the great flaring forth, the primeval fireball, divides itself into the primordial plasma and the earliest stars, as we're seeing through the James Webb Space Telescope, and the emergence of galaxies and solar systems, and ultimately our blue-green planet, and all the miraculous complexity of life forms we encounter. The second principle he traces in the cosmic process is subjectivity, that the universe moves toward greater interiority. and really borrowing from Teilhard, this idea that matter has an inside, and that humans, as I mentioned, are one mode in which the universe intensively understands itself as such. He says we all carry worlds within us, and that this universe story is contained within our pores. And third, he brings forth this principle of communion, that we are deeply interconnected with all of life, that each atom of the universe is affecting all other atoms. We see this in the sense of living in an earth community where what happens to one of us happens to all of us. And Thomas wants to bring forth this, as Mary Evelyn said, this Buddhist sense of praditya samutpada, or dependent originations, interconnectedness of all of life. And so this new story brought forth by Thomas provides the sense of awe and wonder and psychic zest for life, as Teilhard would say, to animate the transformation from an era in which humans have wrought tremendous destruction of the Earth's living systems into what he calls an Ecozoic era of human and Earth flourishing. And that hopeful sentiment is really captured in these concluding lines of the essay, where he writes that the basic mood of the future might well be one of confidence in the continuing revelation that takes place in and through the Earth. If the dynamics of the universe from the beginning shaped the course of the heavens, lighted the sun, and formed the Earth, if this same dynamism brought forth the continents and seas and atmosphere, if it awakened life in the primordial cell and then brought into being the unnumbered variety of living beings, and finally brought us into being and guided us safely through the turbulent centuries, there is reason to believe that this same guiding process is precisely what has awakened in us our present understanding of ourselves and our relation to this stupendous process. Sensitized to this guidance, we can have confidence in the future that awaits the human venture. And it's this sense of hopeful, participatory story that animates the Journey of the Universe film. And for the last 3.5 years, I've been really fortunate to serve as the project director for Journey of the Universe, for the film, the book through Yale University Press, the podcast series, where 10 years ago, Mary Evelyn interviewed leading scientists, artists, activists, and environmentalists. And I am also hosting an ongoing podcast series, interviewing folks who have been influenced by the Journey of the Universe film, and this sense of a deep time perspective, and how a context of cosmology can be brought to bear in what Thomas Berry calls the great work. And what are the implications of the Journey of the Universe project for ecological economics, for Earth jurisprudence and rights of nature, for ecological spirituality, and for ecological education, right? So Thomas Berry's legacy continues through our Journey of the Universe project, which is this invitation to dwell in the cosmic river in which we find ourselves, to see ourselves as Brian Swims calls, the progressive wavefront of 14 billion years of cosmic evolution, and how we can invoke those creative energies to create a more regenerative and flourishing presence on this planet. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Sam, for that very passionate and articulate presentation on Tom's story, new story. I invite you now all, as participants, to take another moment, a minute of silence before we invite Kathleen to provide her presentation. Thank you, everyone. Last but not least, we are going to hear from Sister Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Thank you for guiding us in this wonderful conversation. And thank you to Neil for the invitation to be with all of you, and especially to be with my wonderful Berry family, Mary, Evelyn, and John, and to have the joy of seeing the next generation, the next wave of this teaching coming forward, of what I call the Berryan school of Ecozoic wisdom. Well, everybody comes to Thomas Berry from their own location, which for me was, and it continues to be, the field of theology, or more precisely from those many campuses or the schools of spirituality that have developed over millennia. These wisdom schools invite the transformation of human persons by the activation of archetypal, symbolic, sacramental, linguistic, performative, and embodied systems of insight and understanding offered through transmission of and immersion in some sort of comprehensive sacred wisdom. One could say that these schools of sacred wisdom have developed curricula that function, as Thomas Berry might say, like creative coding systems that, if effectively communicated to the mind and the sensorium of a person, can give rise to certain powers of human nature that amplify us, that cause us to be more, to see more, to become more. In some sense, they cause us to be newly human. They can trigger the next iteration of human sensitivities and virtue. And almost every such school of spiritual transformation has an archetype of the new human type to be activated. Each school has its own icon of the human reimagined. And then, if one truly appropriates and practices the new way of being, the human, in some sense, is remade, or in Thomas's terminology, reinvented. Such sacred codes for reanimating human nature, if deeply embedded, can in fact evolve a person, do in fact evolve people, and in so doing, evolve the species as we are ordained to do. This is one of the constructive potentials of religion. Such systems of illumination or enlightenment can be conveyed in a myriad of ways to various receptors of our human nature, with the effect of altering us, of amplifying us. And this has forever fascinated me. When I met Thomas Berry, I was in the process of learning the various curricula of such wisdom schools. Within my own spiritual lineage as a Catholic Christian theologian, my studies had for me, for the most part, they had me looking back in a kind of rear view mirror at, yes, rich and beautiful spiritual cultures that endowed us with rich, beautiful tapestry of what we might call sapiential history. There was, and there still are, the depths of the contemplative masters of the Carmelite tradition, Dominican tradition, Benedictine masters, Orthodox and Eastern masters, the masters of the Western Isles. My own interest in early American spiritualities had me investigate the practitioners of a radically integral vision of what a community of the regenerated might look like. I refer to the American Shakers. And in this spiritually rich interval of study and discovery, there were, of course, the life ways of the first peoples of North America. Yet all these allurements had me looking away, looking behind, looking at something other, born in and from some other place, some other time, some other set of circumstances. Even modern spiritual masters were mostly dedicated to the work of recovery of these ancient or other lineages to bring them to postmodern seekers who wanted maps and modalities to access such perennial wisdoms, ever ancient, ever new. And I bow here to the multi-faith bridge builder and dialogian, Thomas Merton. But still, all these wonderful voices sounded derivative to me until I happened into, and this was by grace more than by choice, one of Thomas Berry's transformation sites, his Fordham University classroom in the early 1970s, where I had the enormous joy of meeting Mary Evelyn and John and a host of others, where each week for some years I was with them audience to his utterly new speech, elaborating a new historical moment, a new cosmological moment, in a new ecological moment of crisis. And this professor had learned not just the canons of every religion on the planet, but also—
It's 3:00.
Excuse me. Thank you, Alexa. But also the histories of nearly every cultural world from the beginning. I experienced being immersed, dare I say in my own parlance, baptized in such illuminating wisdom that I knew I had happened into a radically new school of visionary teaching, being spelled out in a new human vocabulary by a humble genius who at 60 years old was in some sense just getting started. Looking back to then, I would say now that I had entered into the Berryan school of transformation, the only true descriptor for which is Thomas's own words, Ecozoic, a curriculum for the new human species in communion with all species for the life of the planet. an era of newly recovering life for the planet. Berry's school of Ecozoic wisdom, as we know, is still under construction on many creative platforms, and we've heard about some of them today, particularly from Sam, all of which focus us on the revelatory utterance of the living earth herself within the ever unfolding universe. What emerges from the depths of the new story that Thomas told is a never before beheld cosmological revelation, reported to us not as a scientific summary of mathematical cosmology, but as a sacred scripture for the meta-religious movement Thomas inaugurated, and which continues to be developed under his suasion and inspiration. So I extol Thomas the seer, who was no less the sayer of it all, a storyteller possessing a linguistic lexicon that at once made you dizzy with insight and sober with responsibility. Thomas was a wordsmith who coined a new vocabulary to tell the new story and to summon us to the great work. Indeed, Thomas is preeminently, to me, the poet eloquently elucidating in his own dialect realities just coming into view, and not a moment too soon. Student of the spiritual techniques and technologies that I was becoming and that I became, I have loved living with Thomas's word, but not simply as a theologian or a scholar. I've loved living with his word as a contemplative, an ecozoic contemplative, submitting myself to the renewal of my human habits of mind and practice that would rebirth me among the new humans of the new story. And being, as I am, as much a minister as a scholar of sacred wisdom, I have ever wanted to create beautiful ways for religious people to morph into such ecozoic humans. And to serve this desire, it's been my practice to recreate contemporary expressions of those popular formularies of another time called books of hours, a book of hours. And so I have done this for Thomas Merton and Teilhard de Chardin, and now I'm turning my appreciation to Thomas Berry. It is, I think, a subtle but real shift to come to Thomas's literary legacy, not as instruction, not as academic tracts, but as a kind of sacred scripture, an ecozoic scripture, with which to practice ecozoic contemplation. A lectio divina, not of transcendence, but of, as Thomas would say, incendence. A transforming lectio of earth, always and everywhere revealing herself to us as the living jewel of the ever unfolding cosmos, prayed anew by a new kind of living kind. So, with what is left of my time, I wish to share one instance, one little facet of the beauty and power of Thomas's Poetics, of what sounds to me in terms like psalms and litanies and epistles. Canticles spring off the pages when I read Thomas, koans and blessings of the Ecozoics. So let me offer a glimpse of what I sense to be a Berrien psalm to pray during a moment in time, as this book of ours will be comprised of his poetics to be prayed at dawn, day, at dusk, or at dark during a day of the week. A Berrien book of hours composed exclusively of Thomas's contemplative poetics. So mindful that the Ecozoic is Thomas's name for that world in gestation, that mind state in emergence, that new state of affairs born of our hopes and our dreams and our prayers. Yes, our prayers for this Ecozoic. Let us just turn now reflectively to what I hear as a Berrien psalm. We are returning to our native place after a long absence, meeting once again with our kin in the earth community. For too long, we have always been somewhere else, entranced with our industrial world of wires and wheels, concrete and steels, and our unending highways, where we race back and forth in continual frenzy. The world of life, of spontaneity, the world of dawn and sunset and glittering stars in the dark night heavens, the world of wind and rain, of meadow flowers and flowering streams, of hickory and oak and maple and spruce and pineland forests, the world of desert sand and prairie grasses, all within, and all this with the eagle and the hawk, the mockingbird and the chickadee, the deer and the wolf and the bear, the coyote, the raccoon, the whale and the seal, and the salmon returning upstream to spawn. All this, the wilderness world, recently rediscovered with heightened emotional sensitivity, is an experience not far from that of Dante meeting Beatrice at the end of the Purgatorio, where she descends amid a cloud of blossoms. It was a long wait for Dante, so aware of his infidelities, yet struck anew and inwardly pierced, as when hardly out of childhood he had first seen Beatrice. The ancient flame was lit again in the depths of his being. In that meeting, Thomas is describing not only, in that meeting, Dante is describing not only a personal experience, but the experience of the entire human community at the moment of reconciliation with the divine after a long period of alienation and human wandering away from the true center. Something of this feeling of intimacy we can now experience as we recover our presence within the earth community. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sister Kathleen, for your beautiful perspective and for appropriately ending with the very poetic words of Thomas Berry himself. So I invite you now again to share a minute of silent reflection. And then when we return, I would like to invite the panel to share with each other some insights or reflections on what they heard from each other. And then we'll open it up to questions. So questions can either be put into the chat or you can raise your hand after the 10-minute panel discussion. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. I would now like to invite the panel to share with each other, with the rest of us, some reflections perhaps on your beautiful individual presentations. So I'll leave it to you to self-regulate who goes first. And
I just wanted to say that John unfortunately had to go to another meeting, but he left in the chat a little message of greetings. I also want to emphasize, he says, Thomas Berry's interactions with and learning from Indigenous elders, their shared understanding of the primary shaping influence of the Earth community on humans find ancient wisdom expressions. And it was, of course, through studies with Thomas Berry that John picked up his life work of Native American traditions, of shamanism. And it was in a class in about 1976 that Judy Emery and myself and my brother and several others at Barnard, Thomas Berry taught he taught the first course in Native American religions, but also at Fordham way back then, had a whole room at the Riverdale Center of Indigenous books, reflections, and they had enormous respect for him. Oren Lyons, of course, very close to a number of these leaders. And when he went up to James Bay in Canada, they recognized him as an elder. Many of them gave him drums and pipes and things like that over the years. So he was revered, and he brought into our consciousness and many, many people's that deep appreciation of Indigenous wisdom and knowledge.
thank you, Mary Evelyn, and John, of course, for reminding us of Thomas's enduring relationship with Indigenous peoples.
Kathleen, I loved your story of course, how the other spiritual traditions that you were studying early on seemed the back mirror instead of the rear view mirror, instead of looking forward. And I think that was all of our experience at Fordham, and you put it so beautifully. And I think, Sam, I'm just wanting to draw you both out, perhaps. Sam, in a similar way, the upheaval of all of our lives, certainly during COVID, but the sense of a search for meaning, I think has been so great, and I'm sure with other people on this Zoom. So anyway, if either of you want to comment on this search for meaning that Thomas just brought forward so beautifully and so often.
I was moved regarding the search for meaning, that Mary Evelyn, you noted that those students who gathered, particularly at the Riverdale Center, you phrased it by saying we were trying to create a community around Thomas. I think Thomas was a community maker. I mean, he was magnetizing. He drew people to himself. And as with the birth of any real community, of which I've been involved in a few, there something happens. The members become, of course, like a family. They begin to resemble each other. They influence each other tremendously. And sometimes they develop a new language. And I'm just really fascinated by this notion of Thomas and language. The many, many languages of meaning that he spoke. And in these various courses that he taught, and in these wonderful essays that you and John especially have facilitated putting in our hands, we have learned from him these variety of languages also. And yet the language that I'm most eager to promote, so to speak, is Thomas's own language and ways of speaking and ways of narrating and engaging us in the story of the universe, of the earth, of the emergence of a new human. And that's what I hope this little book of ours will assist people in doing, as some people say, metabolizing his language as we pray it.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Kathleen. Sam, if I may, I have a question for you, and this could be a huge presumption on my part, but I assume that you're too young to have known Thomas personally, and that your knowledge of Tom and I really enjoyed your presentation because it reminded me very much of how I tried to articulate what I learned from Tom. Over many, many years. It took a long time, but you're one of the few people probably in this group that hasn't had a chance to hear Tom directly or be in the magnetic field of his presence. So how is it that you are so inspired to embrace his teachings and to take it forward, as it were?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Roberto. And taking up Mary Evelyn's question about the search for meaning has been something that has animated my life from a very young age. And that journey, shaped me in my early Presbyterian upbringing and my own experience in Sunday school and reading the Gospels growing up. And yet I also felt as though I needed to look beyond the tradition of my upbringing for satisfying answers to some of the questions I was asking. And so that journey took me to Sri Lanka, where I studied Buddhism for a semester. I later returned and lived in a small Buddhist village for a year, studying rituals and an agrarian way of life. And when I met Mary Evelyn and John as a young teacher, like I felt this sense of this chasm in my psyche, was bridged between spirituality and science, and between the Western religious tradition of my upbringing and the Eastern traditions of Buddhism and the world's religions. And so for me, Thomas represents this bridge builder, building the new in the wineskin of the old, of honoring our ancestral lineages, understanding the psychic and material development of our cultural traditions, understanding the evolution of our earth. Where do we come from? How did we become to be these self-reflexive agents of matter spirit? And for me, Thomas provided that those taproots of the ancient, and also a vision of what is emerging now, right? How do we harness this ancient wisdom born from our cultural traditions, born from the cosmos herself, and then bring that to bear on the most pressing issues of our time? So I'm both fascinated by the ancient wisdom he brings forth and enchanted by what is emerging, what is possible in this Ecozoic age. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. At this point, does anybody in the audience have a question for esteemed presenters? Yes, Judy. You can unmute yourself.
I have a comment and a question. Remembering Thomas as a teacher and as part of a community, he never sought any kind of occult type relationship with his students, and he always strove to enthuse and inspire his students, but he also had a great part in learning from them. He took everyone seriously. And if someone asked him a question that would seem like a silly question or a stupid question, he would make it the right kind of question, and he would give the right answer. So that's the comment. The question is to Sam. You use the term ecological spirituality, and I can see some aspects of that, like what Kathleen was talking about when she used the term Ecozoic contemplation, and then Earth as teacher. But I was wondering if you had any more comments on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, Judy, and something I spend a lot of time sitting with. I think of ecological spirituality perhaps as the way that the earth beckons to us and the way we respond to the allurement, as Thomas and Brian call, of our sacred universe. It's the sense of zestful participation and attraction to our deepest participation in this reality. And for me, it's ecological spirituality because it moves beyond the walls of an institution, moves beyond the boundaries of a book, and roots in the soil of the earth and of the larger cosmos. And so I think every religious tradition, as Mary Evelyn and John have spent a lifetime excavating, has a profound ecological depth in the way that the traditions speak to our embeddedness in the earth and the larger cosmos. And so tapping into the ecological depths of interrelatedness that expand our hearts and our minds into beloved community with our human and more than human family is how I would understand ecological spirituality. But I would be curious if Sister Kathleen and Mary Evelyn have any other thoughts as two leading luminaries who've spent their lifetimes exploring these questions.
Well, maybe I'll jump in because it is a great question, Judy, and love your answer, Sam, and certainly Kathleen has something to say too. We've been giving talks over this last year on ecological spirituality, ecological justice, and I think the unity of these is exceedingly important because it comes back to this wisdom, compassion. If we don't have the contemplation, if we don't ground ourselves in an ecological spirituality, we'll burn out. And so the ecological justice, and I burned out in the 60s with civil rights and anti-Vietnam War. And I said, when Nixon came into office, I'm leaving. And I went to Japan for 2 years until I came out of a Zen retreat. And there on the subway in Tokyo said, Nixon resigns. I can come back home. But I think what Thomas has brought forward is this extraordinary sense. There is no spirituality without spirituality of the earth. And this wonderful essay that the Sisters of Earth want to use for their contemplation and reflection is one of the best essays, especially as it is in the Sacred Universe, adapted from the early Riverdale papers. And that insight is extraordinary because it goes back to, it's cosmological. It's related to Teilhard, of course. It's the interiority of matter and so on. And very few people are saying that. There's a tremendous sense that nature spirituality is what we need and so on. And indigenous spirituality is what we need. But this is a different kind of cosmology that's absolutely essential to to say there's no spirituality without spirituality of the earth is extraordinary. Indigenous peoples understood this, of course. But anyway, I could say more about its relationship to ecological justice, but I just wanted to highlight Thomas's vision and the wellspring that he gave us in his writing, in Meadow Across the Creek, in his poetry. So Kathleen, I don't know if you want to add to that. And you have lots to say.
Yes, I agree. I think for me, my sense, my deepening sense is that ecological spirituality or cosmological spirituality is working with the energies and powers of the universe herself to manifest where it wants to manifest, which is I'm the center, so to speak, or I am a horizon of its awareness, wants to be activated in me. So we're working on a project right now, another colleague and I, Scott Thompson, we're working on a project called Becoming Cosmos. And it is a way of laboring into the activation of, we might use Brian Swim's language of the energies of the universe or the powers of the universe to become really operative in me, to consciously allow myself to I don't want to say appropriate, because they're in me in dormancy. It has to do with allowing these powers of the universe, one of several, of course, which will be wanting to actualize the justice facet that you're speaking of, Mary Evelyn. the collaboration, the mutuality of all creatures of, in our case, this planet, to live in harmony and in that cosmology of peace that Thomas was speaking of, a cosmology of peace and justice. But these powers and these orientations, and I love the language of virtue, it means power. These virtues have to be evoked. They need to be called forth and they need to be practiced. And that's what I see contemplation being about. I don't necessarily see it as simply a process of sitting, as you know, sometimes we say in the Eastern schools, did you sit today? Well, it's more than sitting for an hour. It's literally opening up one's ecozoic senses to live in this revelatory universe that we live in, responsive in the moment. It's contemplative. It's contemplative life and living.
Love it. Sarah, it looks like you have your hand up.
Yes, Sarah, unmute yourself.
I will do. Hello, everybody. I'm, along with Neil, in Scotland, and I'm wondering if anybody else is here in Scotland, or are you all in North America tonight? What I wanted to say was just to thank you all for a really wonderful presentations about Thomas Berry. Thomas Berry is just a name to me before tonight. And I've sort of been wondering where I heard his name, but I think it was probably through Findhorn. And I've just come down today back to Edinburgh from Findhorn. I'm a regular visitor to Findhorn and participate in the community there. And just a week ago, we were having a call about the founders of Findhorn. And this tonight's call about Thomas Berry follows on so well from that conversation which we had. The founders of Findhorn, Eileen and Peter Caddy and Dorothy McLean particularly, were living this consciousness, although, you know, different people, I think, on our kind of earth have been bringing in this consciousness. And it's lovely to hear more about Thomas Berry, because I didn't really know anything about his life or his teaching before tonight. And you've really brought it home to me in a very vivid way. And, you know, I just feel at home that everything that you've been sharing resonates with, you know, the consciousness that was practiced by the founders of Findhorn. And in terms of what you were saying, Sister Kathleen, you know, they were very, very dedicated. It actually does take some work to activate these energies, these powers that are within us all and surround us all, but to come into a place of more awakened consciousness where we can participate in a more alive way with our universe. That's the essence of what this is about. And there was a conference at Findhorn called some years ago called the New Story Summit. And I'm pretty sure Thomas Berry was one of the people who inspired this conference, because it was about, as I understood it, the story that we tell ourselves influences how we see our world. And so, as I understand your sharings tonight, you know, it's lovely to hear from each one of you, you know, the doorways into this consciousness. And I especially loved the words that, yes, we're deeply interconnected with all of life, and awakening the awe, the wonder, the psychic zest for life. I don't know if that was Thomas Berry's words, but I love those words.
That's Teilhard. That's what he was trying to do. And that conference was inspired by Thomas at Findhorn. Yeah.
It was. Okay, great to hear that, Mary Evelyn. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I believe, Maureen, you had your hand up, or did you take it down? Or...
Yes, I did. Thank you, Roberto. I'm so grateful for this. I wish we were hundreds here to hear what we've heard. And Roberto, just a connection here. Steve Dunn was one of my earliest teacher at St. Michael's University, and I had the wonderful gift of seeing your creation of St. Gabriel's a few years back. Mary Evelyn and John have been mentors for me all along the way. Miriam McGillis, Rosalie Bertel, you, Kathleen, with your beautiful contemplative spirit, and I have the Book of Hours of Teilhard. I can't wait for the one to come out of Thomas Berry. And I wonder, is that coming out soon?
It's due in May, so.
Okay, wonderful. I'll advertise it for you to the Sisters of Earth. I have a memory of Thomas. I was living at Genesis Farm for 7 years, and he would come from the Riverdale Institute almost every year that he was still there before moving back to North Carolina. And after breakfast, and this connects with your question, Judy, about spirituality and ecology, but after breakfast, Thomas had the pattern of just walking out of the farmhouse and away from the buildings and into the woods. And he did that every morning, and maybe 45 minutes he'd reappear. And that always spoke volumes to me. I can still see him, those of you who knew him personally, that little jacket and the same shoes and the blue shirt. And he would just have his hands maybe behind his back as he walked slowly, but just disappearing down that pathway into the woods and reappearing. And then he dedicated, the Dream of the Earth, I believe it was that he dedicated to the great red oak. And I just see him sitting there hours upon hours, days upon days, perhaps writing the Dream of the Earth, which was such an inspirational book for me. Like Sam shared some of his points of conversion at Wisdom House and what he experienced there. That book was revelatory for me. It was transformative. And I was teaching inner city children in Boston at the time. One door opened to another for me. But one of the things that I've always wondered about was Thomas' frequent reference to Dante. And Kathleen, you brought that in so beautifully with the song, and especially Beatrice. And as I learned the story of the meadow and how deep that was for him and how he came back to that at the end of his life as kind of like the context for understanding everything, I often wondered, was Beatrice an archetype? Like, was she the meadow? Was she the sacred earth? Was she the sacred universe? I know that when he went to Italy on those summer symposiums or whatever they were called, forums, he had the class focus on Dante for the first half of their time together, and then on aspects of the great work or cosmology. But his fascination with Dante, Beatrice, in those writings, I've been doing a little bit of study myself of it. It's a huge volume of 3 books, but it's very deep. So any comments on that, of his experience of Beatrice, the archetype, Italy, Assisi?
Just very quickly, and I'll turn it back to Kathleen. He had a reading group on Dante at the Riverdale Center, and we would go over there and he would read it aloud and we would discuss it and so on. But I think of course, Beatrice is incredible inspiration. I'll leave that to Kathleen, but the journey image, the journey archetype is what, he would draw out of Dante, and that incredible moment when he had to go to paradise without Beatrice, was, John uses the phrase, because Thomas Berry came into the Riverdale Center porch at one point, and John he lived with him the year before we were married and was writing his dissertation, and he was a little low doing that work. But Thomas quoted Dante back to him Alsa la barba, lift up your beard and go forward, at that moment for Dante. So anyway, there's so much to say about that. And I think Joe Iannone, I just see, Joe, I believe, was involved, of course, with St. Thomas and all of this. So I hope you'll jump in at some point. Delighted to see you there. But to Beatrice, so much can be said. And Kathleen, please, jump in.
Well, I deeply regret that I wasn't part of that reading group, and I never had the benefit of Thomas opening up the book of the Divine Comedy to us. But it does make me realize what I always felt in his presence, that he was a poet, and he had the sensibility, he had the poet's nature, and he could read in a medieval text or a Renaissance text of, an extraordinary morality story, so to speak. He could read the universe into it. And I love that about Thomas. I love that Thomas never let anything go, because everything does belong, and he wove it all through, whether it was, texts from Lao Tzu or texts from the Western poets or anything. It all belongs, and that is part of his genius to me, is that he is a kind of universe in his own right, guiding us around the universe.
Beautiful. Joe, do you want to say anything about the Italy conferences?
Sure. Hi, I'm here in Hollywood Beach, Florida, so you know where I am. The ocean is down the corner, so I'm in a gifted place. From 1990 to 1995 at St. Thomas here in Miami, we had Tom and Miriam McGillis also every year. Teach a course, have a conference. I think we did his birthday. Life is a celebration. Some of his family members came. So my wife and I really hosted him, and we're amazed by him and of course his wisdom. But a couple of things, and also we started the study abroad. He went with our students to Ecuador, to Assisi, and we had 10 of those Assisi conference. Sam was at the last one. Anyway, a couple of things are really funny about him, because when he interacted with the undergrads, he loved that. Someone asked if we had a highway going by the university, and some young man asked him, what's one thing I could do? How young people, and he said, what you could do is turn that highway into a bike path. A bike path. And of course, those young people were just like stunned. It was so radical. The other thing, I remember him saying that if he had read Maria Montessori before he wrote that essay that Sam talked about, he would have had to write the essay, because she was so grounded, in the earth, that kind of education. And the final thing, which is a little radical, we had him give an honorary doctorate, I think one of the 94, I guess. And my wife and I were driving him to the celebration, and he said something like, India is going to have 1 billion people very soon. They have to adopt that policy China has, one child. I said, Tom, please do not say that at the graduation. He had those radical insights. He just kind of like blurted them out. So, spending the time with him was just a grace period, and his gifts are still reverberating through the people like Elizabeth Ferraro, Mary McGillis, of course. Mary McGillis with her Cosmic Walk, and Max Smith at Miami-Dade Ethics Institute is still, his work is going. So he's really flourished what he did in our community. So thank you. Thanks for this. It's wonderful.
Thank you. St. Thomas really led the way. Thank you, Joe.
Well, I'm aware that we're very close to our time, and I'm wondering if this is if we just end with our gratitude and our thanks to our amazing speakers who do such a wonderful job of keeping alive Tom's work. I'm so grateful to you all and for your sphere of influence, which is a place of hope for me in this wasteland that we seem to find ourselves in these days. So once again, I want to thank everyone for attending and for the beautifully articulate and heartfelt and loving sharing of our speakers. And of course, to Tom himself.
I want to thank you, Roberto, if I could, sorry, just for St. Gabriel's, this incredible church in Toronto that's been mentioned, and your work for many, many years that highlights Thomas over and over again. We're so grateful. And to Neil as well for bringing us all together. But thank you for hosting. Thank you, everybody, as well. And dear colleagues, Kathleen, Sam.
So Neil? Thank you, Neil. I'll let you, as the IT person, to bring us to our natural close, and blessings to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. It was a joy to be together. And
Thank you, everyone. Beautiful.
You, Sam.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes.